But Greta, why don't I just turn it over to you? And again, just thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you, Heidi, and good evening, everyone. I am super excited to spend some time with you this evening. When I got the invite from Heidi, I was just thrilled because anything that Heidi sends my way just puts a smile on my face. So thank you for the invitation. I often have an opportunity. I'm a native Washingtonian, so I often have an opportunity to do these types of, facilitate these types of forums in the inner city. Here in Washington, D.C., at a lot of local churches and high schools. So with the pandemic, of course, it didn't happen this year. So I was more than happy to receive this invitation just to talk to you as administrators about financial aid. I know you're the first point of contact for many students, and financial aid in the eyes of some students, especially first generation students, can seem as a monumental task and process. And so any information that I can help you with to help your students, please do not hesitate, even after this forum is over, to reach out, and I will be more than happy to assist you in the process. Let me just start. So if I understood the audience that I'm speaking with, you all teach juniors and seniors in high school, is that correct? Okay. And just so that I just have a better feel, can you just share the types of questions that your students are posing to you about the financial aid process? Just one or two, if any. Nothing?
I'll just mention that they're just feel overwhelmed by all the paperwork.
Okay.
So, I know that sounds very like, well, it's just like the things that we all go through, but just navigating through that paper storm, I know that's a big concern.
Okay. Okay. That's a good question. Anybody else?
I had a student ask me the other day what the CSS was, right? Okay. We had talked about the FAFSA at some point, but a college had asked him to fill out the CSS and he just didn't understand why or what it was. Okay.
All right. So I do have a little presentation I kind of put together. I didn't want to make it too long, but let me just share it with you. I hope my technology works as well. 1 second here. Let me know if you can see this. Let me share my screen first. Are you able to see this?
Yep, all good, Greta.
Okay, great. So I just want to start. This is basic financial aid 101. And if you have questions, please stop and interrupt, and ask your questions. I think one of the key points that if you take nothing else away from this presentation that I want you to share with your students is that there are two methodologies that institutions use to award financial aid. And one of those methodologies is what we call the merit-based methodology. And the second methodology is the need-based methodology. And so what I stress to my students, number one, is never let the price tag of an institution scare you away from attending, especially if you feel that that school is a good fit, it has the right curriculum for you, you're investing in your future. The second thing that I tell them is learn immediately how they award financial aid. And so what you see before you is just a basic breakdown of the two methodologies. And, not to insult anyone's intelligence, but of course, the merit-based awarding is based on a student's GPA, standardized tests, and academic achievements. The need-based is more so based on what we call a need analysis. The basis for all of these, for either of these methodologies, is what we call the FAFSA application, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a few minutes. So for the merit-based, it's the FAFSA, and then a lot of times the institutions have what they call their own institutional form that they create and ask students to complete in addition to the FAFSA application. On the the need-based side, it's the FAFSA, and I think someone already brought up the question about the CSS profile. The CSS Profile is another supplemental application if the school, they don't have their own institutional form. This form is set up by the College Board amongst a lot of academic advisors, financial aid advisors, excuse me. And we talk about the different allowances and different costs of attendances throughout the United States. So it's a form that's put together by a group of financial aid advisors that some schools use in place of their own institutional form. So at the basis of this, whether it's merit-based, the FAFSA is always going to be the foundation, and there will more than likely be an institutional form that they will ask the student to fill out. For the need-based, the FAFSA will always be the foundation. And if it's not the CSS Profile, they may have their own institutional form that they ask students to fill out as well. But first things that students need to understand after recognizing or identifying the schools that fit for them is, how does an institution award financial aid? So that would be one key point. Okay, so we talked about the FAFSA application. I'm pretty sure all of you have heard this. What is the FAFSA application? It is the free application for federal student aid. This is an application that is created by the Department of Education, and it allows students to apply for federal funds that they can use towards their cost of attendance. Basically, what they are doing is they're using information. There is since the Obama administration got involved in this process, they put a procedure in place called prior. The FAFSA application was a very stressful application for a lot of parents to complete because it was requiring them to complete their tax information for, let's say if you're going into the 21-22 academic year, they would need to have their 19-20 tax returns completed right away. And a lot of parents weren't able to get the application completed as quickly as they needed to, which caused some delays in the financial aid process. So under the Obama administration, they implemented a new process called prior. So students and their parents are actually completing this FAFSA based on data that is somewhat, I want to say almost 2 years old. So for this year, when we do the need analysis, or we did the need analysis for the current academic year, we're looking at families' information based off of the calendar year 2018. And in some cases, some families may say, well, 2018 was 1 year, but it really doesn't reflect where we are right now. And we'll get into a little bit of that a little later as well. So what happens is the students and the parents, they log on to the FAFSA. There's a student identification number that is assigned to them. There's a parent identification number that is assigned to them. And basically what they are doing is they're filling out this application based on their total income of that given calendar year. And so for this year, it would have been completed based on the 2018 tax information. And what happens is the Department of Education does what we call a very liberal calculation based on what they self-reported. And they get, and you'll see at the bottom right-hand corner, the acronym EFC, and that stands for Estimated Family Contribution. Well, how do they get that information? That's a calculation, again, based on what they reported in terms of income, untaxed income. It doesn't look at any assets or things of that nature. The CSS Profile and other institutional forms do take a more stringent look from that component. So what I tell my families is that EFC, that 5431, this random number here, that is a base minimum expected family contribution that parents and students should be prepared to pay towards their costs. Now, this number is, subject to revision if there has been some changes since 2 years ago when they filled out when they did their tax returns. So they fill out the FAFSA, they get back, they being the student, something called a SAR, which is a student aid report. And basically all that is it's a summary of all of the information that they put on that application. And so what I encourage families to do is to look at that information. And in particular, I need you to look at the comment sections, because if there is something wrong, many times parents use their social security number instead of the student's social security number. the date of birth could be wrong. And if any of those pop up, the institution that is scheduled to receive this information will get something that we call a C flag, meaning that the application was not properly processed and that the student is being asked to get in contact with you, us rather, the school, to have that matter resolved. So your students that are filling out the FAFSA, and I like to encourage my even sophomores to just go online at FAFSA.gov and just fill out that application so that they can get a feel for the types of questions that they are going to be asked to complete when it's their time to apply for financial aid. It takes into consideration the family size, and it also allows you to list, I think it's up to 12 schools now that the FAFSA will allow you to implement what we call the school code. So the student needs to know the financial aid school code of the institution that they're interested in, and this information is sent to schools electronically. So if the student is accepted, this information, like here at Georgetown, is downloaded into our system, and we can begin to do what we call an analysis and verification. That's, I think, the basic part of the FAFSA is a lot of families have a hard time just getting through the basic questions. And then what happens is every year you go in and you update that information. So you don't have to basically, you're reapplying for financial aid, but you're still on the same template. You're updating it based on the updated new academic year. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay.
Greta, we've had a few questions come up in the chat here. Hey, Tia Wanda, do you want to go ahead and ask?
Oh, yeah, sure. This was more around the methodologies slide where you were talking about the need-based and the merit-based. And I had a question around, sometimes you run into students, their parents' income looks massive on paper, but they have challenges going on in the home where maybe I had a student this past year, she has a younger sibling in the house who has a rare sickness. And so there's been a lot of medical bills and services and all that those kinds of things that are coming out of pocket with the parents that, you know, are being poured in to help the younger sibling while they're still trying to help her. And so when she submitted her FAFSA, there was just not a lot of room for the need-based component because on the tax forms, it looks like her parents are making loads of money, but when at home, you know, whatever, when it reaches the house, it's sucked up by some of the medical responsibilities they have for the younger child. So I was wondering, how is that kind of dynamic or situation or scenarios considered?
Certainly, great question. So what happens is, unfortunately, the FAFSA does not take into consideration that type of information. So that's where the institutional form or the College Board profile application, students and parents are allowed to get the school's more detailed information. And what I often tell my parents, because these forms are limited, I mean, they're basically asking you pretty straightforward questions, but a lot of times circumstances do not extend themselves to this form. So I encourage my students to send a narrative. I always say, make a friend in the financial aid office. And what you want to establish with that person is you want to be able, we are driven by numbers in the financial aid office, but we also understand that there's a narrative behind it. With circumstances such as medical expenses and secondary educational tuition for younger siblings, a lot of that information is captured on the institutional form or what we call the CSS Profile application, where they will ask you those specific questions. If you had medical expenses, what your medical expenses were. Now, there is what we call an allowance for that. And for this particular year, in order to get the particular allowance, your medical expenses had to be in excess of 5% of your total income. So every year there is an allotment or a percentage that we are permitted to take into consideration as what we call professional judgment. And so I encourage students to fill out the forms, do the basics that you're supposed to do. But in terms of extenuating circumstances such as medical expenses, and a lot of times we capture that information off of your Schedule A, if you're allowed to itemize your medical expenses. Now with the new tax form, sometimes that is not a fair barometer or a way for us to capture that, but in years past, that's how we've caught it. The CSS profile will specifically ask if you have younger siblings in school and if they're in private school, what the tuition is. So there is what we call a secondary allowance that we are allowed to take into consideration to make what we call professional judgments to increase that need on the need-based component, to make sure that we're taking into consideration everything that the family is having to deal with. Now, one factor that we don't deal with is what we call consumer debt. Financial aid does not deal with credit cards. It doesn't deal with your home mortgages, things of that nature. It doesn't deal with, in years past when I was just starting out, we used to take into consideration educational loans of parents. But that is no longer in the equation. So it doesn't hurt for the student just to send a narrative explaining to the financial aid representative, yes, we did the FAFSA, yes, we did the institutional form, or we did the CSS profile, but I need you to know that there are some more extenuating circumstances. Another popular care event that is popped up over the last, I want to say 5 or 7 years, is care for elderly parents, for grandparents that are now living at home with the students and their parents. And so parents are now having to take care of them. So any direct out-of-pocket expenses that are not reflected on these forms, I highly encourage you to have your students send narratives to the financial aid representative articulating basically what they're having to look at. Hope that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thanks.
Sure.
Greta, we had a question from one of our pivotal educators I don't think she's here yet. I'm not sure she's going to be able to make it, but asking about supporting undocumented students in this process. There's kind of a multi-part question, but let me just pull out the undocumented student part here to start with.
Okay.
What do teachers advise for undocumented students with all of this?
So first thing that I would do is, and a lot of, and it's understandable, students are very afraid to self-identify in these cases. But what the students need to do, they need to self-identify. What I recommend is that the students reach out to the financial aid representatives. They don't have to necessarily send a narrative, but they certainly can reach out via telephone and have a conversation with the financial aid representative to get instruction on what they need to do to file the necessary paperwork to be considered for the institutional fund. So undocumented students would not be required to fill out the FAFSA. Obviously, they can't fill out the FAFSA, but if they qualify for any institutional forms, they may be an institutional funding, rather, there would be an institutional form that they could complete. They could certainly complete the CSS Profile application. That is what we ask our students to do, so that we can do that need analysis from the need-based side to determine how much we would be able to offer students. So I know it's a little scary, but they should, if they don't feel comfortable putting anything in writing, but certainly pick up the phone and have a conversation with the financial aid representative, articulating what their circumstances are so that they can be given guidance on how to move forward.
Greta, thank you. Gavin, did you want to go ahead and ask?
Oh, sure. So something my students have been asking, both last year's students and this year's, is especially for the academic base or the merit base, there are different circumstances. Some of them can't take the SAT. We're on lockdown. Some of our students that are seniors now couldn't take it in the spring. There's no availability to take it now. Is there any discussion going on in the kind of financial aid kind of orbit about how they're going to address that? And some schools have been giving everyone A's. So there's going to be grade inflation that's unequally distributed around everywhere.
Yeah. So in particular, at Georgetown, let me say, so Georgetown is a need blind admission. So we don't really interact in terms of the admissions process and the testing components of it. So what I would recommend that a student that is applying to an institution that awards financial aid based on merit is to reach out to the financial aid institution to find out, or the admissions office for further direction and instruction on what the options are, what they can pursue, so that they can be evaluated in terms of their financial aid offers. I think that's probably going to be a very fluid situation in light of the fact that, as you mentioned, students have not been able to take the tests that they need. But I would have to defer that to an admissions representative.
Greta, we've got a follow-up about undocumented students from Carl.
Okay.
Carl, do you want to jump on with?
Yeah, I think one of the things I struggle with guiding undocumented students is which institutions are worth their time and which are not. In other words, is there any resource to help understand that, oh, Georgetown has institutional funds and could possibly, give up to $40,000 to undocumented students, but for example, Liberty University is going to give you nothing, right? And that's just because they don't have as much of an endowment or their own beliefs or whatever it might be. So I'm curious if there's any guidance on which schools are the ones that are worth the time for undocumented students.
Unfortunately, there isn't what I would like to call a safe haven list. There isn't. It's just going to vary from institution to institution because everybody's funding is very different. And now, in light of the pandemic, it's probably going to be even, I don't want to say more difficult, but the process is probably going to be even more stringent. Again, I would just encourage students, if they find a school that's the right fit for them, if they happen to be an undocumented student, that they reach out to the financial aid office and just have the conversation with the financial aid representative, so they can, to find out whether or not it's worth their time to go through the application process if they don't have the funding.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
Greta, we had a question submitted earlier, and Liz is echoing it here about kind of the amount of reasonable debt to take on. I don't know if that's a good question to ask now, or if there's another part in your in the slides that you're sharing when that would apply to kind of think about the balance between scholarship and debt.
It's we can talk about it now. We've heard on the news over the last several years, the student loan debt, the $1 trillion student loan debt. And to be quite honest, I don't think that it's been given a fair narrative. Student loans are very much a part of, and especially when we're talking about need-based financial aid, they're very much a part of meeting that expected need, not so much with merit-based financial aid, but certainly with the need-based component. On average, if a student were to take the standard loans, federal loans that they were given as a freshman, first year through their senior year, they would come out with a maybe overall debt, I want to say about $14,000 to maybe $15,000. Now, that doesn't include if parents take out parent loans. So we're looking at a collective, but students themselves, the way I like to look at it is students are making an investment in their future. A way that students can work around, and a lot of students, I've seen it for myself, students do a lot of hard work in terms of trying to secure outside scholarships. Whereby the loans that they may be offered in their financial aid award may be bought out. So as a first year student at Georgetown, as an example, we offer the standard subsidized loan of $3,500. A lot of students will do work over the summer through different foundations. And if they can secure up to $3,500 or more, then what they're working to do is to reduce their overall indebtedness. So it is a topic that students should be aware of, and it also depends on what the school's policy is in terms of financial aid. Georgetown meets full need. And in meeting that full need, there is a loan component that's involved. There are some institutions that do not meet full need. So they simply say to a student, okay, we've reviewed your application. Your cost of attendance is $20,000. We're able to give you 10. So you have to figure out where the other 10 is coming from. In those scenarios, you do have to be very aware of your overall indebtedness. And there, but again, there are outside scholarships and ways that students can work to help balance the overall indebtedness as they matriculate through their college careers.
Can I ask a follow-up question to that?
Certainly.
Because I think about my own experience in college, and maybe it's just my university was dumb, but if we took like outside scholarships, they remove money they gave us, and we're like, oh, well, you're still getting the money, somebody else is just paying for you.
Right.
Is that a school by school thing?
Yeah. Yeah, so what happens is everyone has what we call a cost of attendance, which is comprised of tuition fees, books, travel, personal. And so by federal regulation, students are not required to have, are not allowed to have financial aid in excess of that cost of attendance. So what happens is we send out an award notice, and it will simply say, if you decide to come to Georgetown your first year, it's going to cost you $50,000. And we're giving you, let's say, $50,000 of need-based financial aid. And then you happen to notify the financial aid representative that, I've been the recipient of a $25,000 outside scholarship. What we are required to do is to incorporate that $25,000 scholarship into that cost of attendance or into that financial aid package. And so what we have to do then is we begin to use the term buyout. We will buy out the student loan, and we'll talk a little bit more about more of the federal programs. The student loan, the work study component is also another piece of that. And then it does get tricky because we then take away basically our Georgetown money, the need-based component, and we use that outside funding. So what I say to my students and their parents are, if you're interested or if you're in the process of applying for outside scholarships, reach out to the financial aid office to say, how much can I apply for or receive in outside funding that you can incorporate into my financial aid package before I begin to touch the institutional scholarship that you have initially awarded me. And in some cases where it exceeds what we call the loan and the work component, I recommend the students reach back out to these foundations to see if they can defer the scholarships for another period of enrollment. Say if they decide to go to summer school, or if they can defer it to the next academic year. But we are required to stay within that cost of attendance budget. And so that's where you see where if the loan has been bought out, the work study component has been bought out, then it becomes a dollar for dollar exchange of the outside funding versus the institutional funding. Any more questions?
I think we're quiet for the moment here in the chat. Greta, why don't we let you go a little bit further, and we'll see what pops up.
Okay. So again, we stopped here. We're talking about the College Board CSS Profile application. And again, this is what many institutions use when they don't have their own institutional form. They will use this particular form to award their institutional money. And so what the CSS Profile does, it takes a more stringent look at a family's ability to contribute towards their son or daughter's education. So on this application, it's going to look at things such as home equity. It's going to look at any assets that the student may have or any assets that the parents may have. Now, the one component that it does not look at and we do not touch are your retirement accounts. So those accounts are safe. If you have any additional real estate, it looks at those types of assets or resources where the need analysis says, this family has a resource that maybe another family doesn't have. And if necessary, you could possibly borrow against, or you could liquidate, things of that nature. So the CSS profile is a more stringent application, whereas the FAFSA is a more liberal calculation. And so what happens is we either take the CSS profile application or that institutional form plus the FAFSA, and we marry them together. We put them together to come up with either your merit-based award or your need-based award. So basic information about the CSS profile application, the report is about $25. The initial application to have the report sent to the various schools is additional $16. Now for students, first generation, in particular at Georgetown, institutions can, what we call, if they use the profile, they can waive this information. If we get it the first year, students can be exempt from this application so that they don't have to spend the $25 annually to have that application completed. The College Board will also, based on the income that is self-reported, determine if a student is eligible for a waiver. You'll often hear students ask questions about, does the financial aid application office have waivers for the CSS profile? The financial aid office does not for the CSS profile application. That is done automatically by the College Board. When students begin to put their information into the system, onto the application, they will direct or instruct a student whether or not they've been waived based on their income that has been reported. Again, not all universities or colleges require this application. Some have their own institutional form. And again, and it helps institutions make the award for their own institutional funding. You're going to use the same information, the same tax information that you used on the FAFSA application on the CSS profile. Again, the CSS profile, however, does allow you to get into some of the topics that we talked about earlier with regards to medical expenses, secondary allowances for private schools, elderly care, things of that nature. It goes a little bit more into in-depth detail. There's also a comment section on the CSS profile and other institutional forms that should allow you or parents to articulate a little bit about what is actually going on in a family's circumstances. And so what we do as financial aid representatives is we look at this application, we look at the comment section, and personally what I do is if I read a comment and I see that, you know, a family is trying to articulate something to me and I need more information, I will then reach out to that family to say, I've read your comments in the CSS profile. In order for us to do a fair and accurate analysis, please send me a narrative with additional information. So you do have the opportunity, and you should also have it on the institutional form to be able to articulate, it's probably just a little small box, maybe 250 words, to articulate what the real picture is. And one example this year, I had a father reach out to me to say, Greta, you know, calendar year 2018 was a great year for me. Unfortunately, I became unemployed at the end of 2018, and I have not been able to find employment. So I'm asking you not to evaluate my son or daughter based on our income for 2018 because it's not accurate. And so what we would do then, or what I did do, is to give the father further instructions on what forms he did need to complete so that we could do an analysis and make a fair and accurate award. Any questions on the profile? Okay, and this is just, and what happens, the format, it's an online application, just like the FAFSA application. And once the students complete this application, it will be processed. Now they will not get what we call a SAR, like we did from the FAFSA, but they will get confirmation stating that their CSS profile or their institutional application has been received. And then students will be prompted to upload that tax information to the College Board. And with that information, what we're doing with it as a financial aid representative is we're verifying those numbers to make sure that what you self-reported matches with the connection. There's what we call the data retrieval piece. matches with the IRS. So Georgetown does what we call 100% verification, meaning making sure that the information that you put on these forms is indeed accurate. Not all schools do 100% verification. Some schools just take your information at face value, and if something changes, then again, you will need to reach out and have a conversation with them about it. Another sticky situation that often happens with students are with students that come from divorced or separated parents, where there really is no relationship with what we call the non-custodial parent. There is what we call a waiver form. Institutions have their own form, but the College Board also has a form. So if they indicate on the form what their parents' marital status is, this will prompt further emails and documents to be submitted by the student to the school that they're interested in. In this case in particular, I can't encourage you enough to have students to write narratives explaining what the relationship or lack there is between the custodial and the non-custodial parent. In many cases, there's never been a relationship, and that information is waived. If that information is waived the first year, it would be waived all 4 years. So you don't have to complete that process or make that request all 4 years. Again, if there are special circumstances such as a loss of employment, a parent is sick and now receiving disability, which has affected income. And so that income that was reported in 2018 is not reflective of where the family actually stands now. That is information that needs to be communicated to the financial aid representative as soon as possible. I think, the big piece is it's just to open up lines of communication. The students should feel comfortable. I always say, make a friend in the financial aid office, someone that you can talk to. And again, what I've come to learn is that, you may not be able to satisfy or accommodate all of the requests, but as financial aid representatives, we can't do for you our very best if we don't know the full circumstances of what the family is looking at. So lines of communication are key in this process.
Greta, let me ask a question that came in from Rita earlier. She was the one who'd also asked about the undocumented students.
Okay.
So she asked a question about, which I think speaks to this issue of the narratives, about how much negotiation is available with financial aid offices at universities. Should students advocate to receive more aid if they really want to attend a school, and how do they go about that?
Okay. We don't like the term negotiate because we don't negotiate. And again, I'm speaking for Georgetown. When we make our offer to you, it is our very best offer based on the information that you have self-reported to us and that we've been able to verify. It's not to say that I haven't received thousands upon thousands of copies of award notices from other schools where students are receiving more financial aid. And so what I would say is, going back to the very first screen that I provided you, separate the award notices that are based on or awarded based on a merit-based methodology versus a need-based methodology. Because comparing the two is like comparing apples and oranges. The methodologies are just so completely different. A need-based institution is never going to be able to compare to a merit-based institution that is awarding a student or giving the student an award, a guarantee award for 4 years. Whereas in the need-based world, we're doing an analysis every year to determine what that need is. And we're also maximizing our federal funds first. So what's going to happen is when we get those letters, and we receive them all the time, we don't negotiate. We don't, try to compare merit-based and need-based because you can't compare them. But if a student has applied to a need-based institution, just like Georgetown, our award letters should be comparable. They should not be very different. Now, if a student is, again, applying for a merit-based award, the two just don't match. And so need-based institutions and merit-based institution awards are never going to come to a compromise on that level because the methodologies are just completely different. So you can certainly instruct your students if they're applying to institutions that have identified themselves as being need-based institutions. And if they see a vast difference in an award from one school to the next, first thing they should do is go back and look at that information that they gave both schools to make sure that both institutions have the same information. A lot of times parents forget that they shared something with one school that they didn't share with another school that makes a world of difference. But if the information is the same and it is apples to apples, the award notices should be comparable for need-based. Merit-based is just completely very different.
Thank you, Greta.
Okay. All right, so this is just my final screen here. And it, just talks about the fee, the cost, and what's required. Things, again, I would want to stress is the methodologies to make sure that students are meeting the deadlines for financial aid. You have to apply for financial aid every year to make sure that they are aware of that they are aware of who their financial aid representative is. If there's a change in their family circumstances, in particular, again, if we're talking about need-based financial aid, or if something happens with a merit-based aid where they drop below the required GPA, they want to find out from that financial aid representative what happens if I'm required to maintain a 3.7 and if I drop to a 3.4, what are the implications of that? What are the consequences for that? On the need-based side, my father had this job, he's no longer working, he became sick, or God forbid, a parent has passed, reach out to the financial aid office and say, since I've completed my application and I've received my award, these things have happened. Can we have a conversation about their impact and what that means to me as a student and what my options are?